This is Podcast, the sound of fundamental research.
Those of you who pay attention will notice that the title of this talk is different from what was announced. The grand overarching ambition is to build a computational grammar of English. At least that's my ambition. And this is one, you could either view this as a stumbling block or as a next mountain range in my journey. This is a point in the frontier of trying to accomplish that task that I have arrived at and that I'm working on with some colleagues this year. Before I jump in, I should point to some partners in crime who are working with us in this SynSem project. We're a good representation of people in the room today. Doug Hauk and Stefan Oakwood are the coordinators, the organizers of the project for this year. The overview is also a local. Pierre just finished defending and has just joined minutes ago, well, last week. Matthew Gotham is also in the team, Joachim Nieder. And we have a special guest, Jan Hayek, who's visiting us this week for the first of, I hope, more than one visit from Prague. Thank you for being here. And then who did I forget? I'll do something. Okay, so that's, and there are a few others who are coming and going, both this fall and during the rest of the year. Some but not all of those people share my interest in this puzzle about gapping. I want to give you a little bit of context and then drag you down into the details, into some of the issues that we're confronting or that I'm confronting and trying to work on this problem. But let me set a little bit of context for you. The ambition of the people around these two tables and in our corner of the larger field of linguistics and computation linguistics is to produce formal models of grammars of natural languages, the languages that humans speak. There are several thousand of those on the planet still. A few die every week, sadly, as their speakers get old and disappear. At the center, we are focused on two aspects of that attempt to build formal models. We're interested in the syntax, that is the form, the syntactic structure, the grouping of words and phrases into sentences, and the meanings of those expressions, those utterances. There's lots of things that we are mostly not thinking hard about. We're not worrying much about the sound systems, about phonology, phonetics. We're not worrying very much about discourse level phenomena, although we have some experts in the group who do work on discourse level representation. We're not interested in the social aspects of language or the history of the languages or all the many other things that are exciting to look at in the study of linguistics. We're taking two particular pieces where we have experience, equipment, tools, and some opinions. And applying those. And we are using a combination of both symbolic and statistical methods. That's a useful characteristic of this group and different from many places. Many groups working on the problem or individuals will apply either just symbolic methods, that is writing down lists of words, properties of rules, classifications, grammar rules, essentially pencil and paper work, thinking hard about the language. And then there are a different and by now larger group of people who work on applying purely or mostly statistical methods to analyzing language, mostly for parsing. Groups you will know about include Google and Microsoft and people with very big sets of machines and lots of data who can look at patterns in language and get the machine to recognize those patterns and do useful things with them. But in the outcome of those purely statistical methods, we don't typically learn very much about the languages that we are studying, the languages that are under analysis. We just get some very useful outcomes from those methods. So here in this group at CAS, we're actually still trying to figure out how language works, how it's represented, how we process it, how we parse, how we generate. And to do that, we have to stare at the properties of the languages themselves through that symbolic lens, as well as with very useful statistical tools. We are trying to serve at least 5 deities all at the same time, and they are mostly at war with each other. They do not play well. We would like to get to precision. That's the most useful thing as a linguist. We like to say, you give me an utterance, a sentence, a phrase, even a longer passage in a language. Let's call it English for the moment. And I would hope that our grammar, our description of the language, would allow us to give you a correct analysis of the syntactic structure and the meaning of that sentence. Coverage is what we typically how we characterize our goal of providing an analysis for everything we see. That is, if this is a good sentence of English, then I should be able, with my grammar, to give you an analysis of that sentence. Those are not the same problem. I can do a really nice, microscopically correct job of pretty short sentences and even some pretty long ones. And then there are sentences of the language that are really well formed that I don't know how to analyze yet. After a few hundred years of studying the English grammar, we still don't know everything about it. We don't have everything completed. And so our goal as linguists is often focused on that coverage dimension. And that's where I'm going to drag you in a few minutes in this discussion of gapping. Ambiguity is a constant pain in the neck, but a very important property of language. Almost any sentence that we say actually has more than one possible interpretation, often more than one analysis. And we mostly don't notice or don't care because the sentence uttered by the speaker is understood in the right way by the hearer, and we don't have any trouble with that. But in fact, the language is extremely flexible. It's part of what gives it its expressive power, but that creates trouble for us when we're building these models of natural language. For those of us that do computation, that try to build implementations using computers for these grammars of languages, we care about efficiency because we only live a finite number of years. And if the machine takes most of those years to give us an analysis of one sentence, we haven't gotten very far. That implementation isn't of much use to us. And then, not universally shared by my colleagues, but by many of them, is the goal of reversibility, of being able to take a grammar of a language and use it to map both from the sentence, the form we see or hear, to its meaning, and back the other direction. That is, we'd like to both do parsing and also be able to generate, if you give me a meaning representation in some good formal semantic notation, I'd like to be able to give you a sentence or most of the sentences, all of the sentences that embody or that encode that meaning. Okay, so just a few assumptions about the syntax that we're doing here. Most of us in this group, and in fact most people working in the field these days, agree that there is a notion of headedness. That is, if you show us a phrase or a sentence of a language, we would expect to find for most, but not all of those phrases, some word or shorter phrase within that larger constituent, which is the head of the phrase. It dictates most of the shape of that phrase and a good part of its core meaning. So in a noun phrase like the very tall tree in the garden, it's not hard to figure out tree is the likely head of that phrase. This is a noun phrase about that tree, and the rest of the stuff in the noun phrase is giving us information to help us identify or understand or view that tree more precisely. Likewise, in the verb phrase, calmly admiring the snow this morning, admiring is the head of that phrase, and snow is an argument, this morning is a modifier telling us something about when that event or activity is located. But there's a very useful notion of providing this identification of the heads of phrases, and whole phrases can be heads of larger phrases. That kind of recursive description gives us a more efficient way of characterizing the language, of describing how the pieces get put together. We also make this rather strong but almost universal assumption in linguistics that at least in syntax and semantics, that the sentence is the bounding unit. I'm going to try and write down the rules of the language in order to tell you how sentences are shaped. And once I've done that, I have done almost all of the work I should need to do as a syntactician and most of the work as a semanticist. Not all of it, because there are some phenomena that cross sentence boundaries. Pronouns are an obvious instance of that. Something like the tree appeared to be covered with snow. Its branches were fluffy and white. That it is referring back to the tree. It's in a previous sentence. And my work is not entirely finished as a linguist if I don't do something about this kind of cross-sentence work. But for the most part, I can live a happy, rich, fulfilling life if I could give you a description of the sentences of a language. I would have told you a great deal of useful information about that grammar. And then, even though most of what I'm going to talk about today is about the syntax, about the form of a particular set of example sentences, of constructions in the language, we are very much interested, all of us around this group, in trying to work out the connection between that form and the meaning of a sentence. That is, what are we trying to convey? Who's doing what to whom in the sentences that we express? And just as a quick example, I won't drag you much into the notation of our logical forms, the kind of representations we use, partly because we don't all agree about what that perfect notation would be, and it gets a little bit messy in the details. But we're looking for something like in the sentence, "The snow is admired by most people," that we would build a logical form that looks like this, where down here on the right, there is an admire relationship holding between the event itself, where I can talk about its time and its tense and aspect. But it's a relation between an X and a Y, two things. Somebody's doing the admiring, something's getting admired. The thing doing the admiring in the sentence is the X, which is most people, and the thing being admired is the snow. That's the Y. Not very complicated here, but as we build longer sentences with 30 or 50 or 60 words, that structure can get relatively rich and complicated. But we would like to have our machinery be able to manipulate these kinds of forms and produce them, check them for formativeness, even ideally do reasoning, inference on the basis of those representations. Okay, one view of the kind of objects we're trying to represent or build, the formal structures we're building, in a sentence like this one: "Some linguists and philosophers quietly admired the tall tree with snow-covered branches." Doesn't matter very much about the content. It just has some of the properties I want. Here is what I would like my grammar to produce for me as the intended analysis of this structure. Now, there are other readings here. I might have tried to use the snow-covered branches to admire the tree. A weird thing to do. I'm not even sure exactly how I would do that. The debate about how many linguists and philosophers there were in the room, if you have, say, 5 linguists and philosophers, where there are just 5 people who are both linguists and philosophers, or some linguists and some philosophers, are you sure there were any philosophers in the room? That's always a puzzle. The representation, both of the syntactic structure and of the interpretation, is variable. That is, there's lots of possible reasons. I'm not going to worry very much about those. Let's pretend we agree that this would be an okay representation. Here is the kind of word-to-word dependency, the most basic way in which we encode that semantic representation. Where you see that admiring event, it's marked with red for your convenience, and it has 2 arguments spinning out from it. One going to the linguists and philosophers, that conjunction of those guys, and one coming over here to the tree. And then off of the tree and the linguists and philosophers, there are other declarations that tell you what's being modified. So we have information about the tree being tall. We know that it's got something to do with snow-covered branches. We know that the branches are covered with snow. There's this recursive operation that tells you what the heads and modifiers and dependents are doing in that sentence. So for those of us doing computation, it would be nice to be able to hand this string of letters with spaces in them to a machine and say, give me that analysis. Produce this structure for me, both in its syntactic structure, and then as a consequence, derive the meaning representation, where we typically assume we're trying to build this part of the meaning, the sentence meaning, not the context-specific meaning, by a rule-based approach that says, given the parts, I can tell you what the whole is, and I'd like to arrive at that structure. If I can produce that, then I can go get some money from foundations and corporations to continue doing research, because this is a useful representation for getting work done. One can build better search tools, one can do machine translation, you can maybe educate small children to fix the mistakes they make when they're going to write. Lots of applications will benefit once I get from this sequence of letters, which is easy for humans and hard for machines, down to this kind of representation where I have removed ambiguity, where I have given a more direct, a more formal encoding of the intended meaning of that sentence. Okay, that's the big space we're playing in. Now, why are we still being employed? Why haven't we done this already a long time ago? Well, there are lots of phenomena in any language. English is no exception. There are a lot of things that we can already do quite well. So with a corpus like the English that you see in the English Wikipedia, it's I guess by now a few 100 million sentences, a few billion words of English text. Rather carefully edited, most of it, unfortunately not all of it very well. And of that kind of corpus, we currently have machines, several different versions around this table, around these two tables, which can handle about 90 to 95% of that data, maybe even 97%. A lot of it is now well behaved. We understand many things about English, probably more so than almost any other language that's been being studied on the planet these days. But even there are things we don't know how to do well. Any given expert around the table will have different places where they have trouble. Jan may have already figured out how to do gapping. I'm not quite sure yet, but probably. Here's a phenomenon that shows up in language after language, even though it's irritating. It would be nice if it didn't exist, but it's convenient. Let me walk you through that. We have a notion of coordination in language. Almost every language, maybe in fact every language, has a word that's something like and another one like or, that let you put smaller things together to make bigger things, noun phrases or verb phrases. So 5 linguists and philosophers, that gives us a bigger noun phrase. Max ate the apple and Sally ate the hamburgers. That's just 2 sentences put together with an and. You can do that with verb phrases, prepositional phrases. These are very flexible tools, and they work like that for almost any language on the planet. In English, like in many languages, we can make that sentence, the second sentence, they're a little more efficient. You can say, Max ate the apple and Sally the hamburgers. Easy to understand, no big surprise there. I just didn't bother giving you that second verb because it was obvious enough from the context. I can do that with verb phrases as well. We gave books to Kim and magazines to Chang. Easy to say, not hard to understand for ordinary humans. And for some kinds of grammar building methods, it's not even too problematic. For me, this is extremely inconvenient because I have that notion of a headedness. I assume that every verb phrase, every noun phrase has a head, and that the head tells me what to do with the rest of that phrase. It gives the kind of roadmap for the legal construction of that object. You take my head away from the second phrase, and these guys are left a bit adrift. We don't really know what to do with the magazines and Mr. Chang because that second verb isn't there to direct traffic. It's not there to tell me what to do. So the missing head is the single focus of what is problematic about this kind of construction. It's the thing that makes life difficult. To give you some sense about the space of that difficulty, let me show you a few variables. And I will pretend you have in 15 minutes mastered some of this notation so that when I write symbols like NP and V and NP and PP, you'll pretend to know what I mean. These are shorthand for kinds of phrases. An NP is a noun phrase, a VP is a verb phrase. These are chunks of the sentence. They fall into a small number of typical categories, and then a very long tail that we won't talk about today. So when I say here's a pattern NPV, NPPP, and so on over here, I'm giving you some guidance about how you should look at that sentence below it and pretend you can see those chunks. So there is a noun phrase, big money, in here. There's a prepositional phrase to schools. Down here, there's a prepositional phrase in California and in Nevada. So these are, but I've written those patterns to show you that there is some variation going on here in when that verb can disappear. And I'm only going to show you for the first part here positive examples. That is, you might think, wow, so English is just chaotic. You can drop that verb out anytime you want, anywhere you want. That's unfortunately also not true. There's some care taken in when you can allow this guy to disappear and when not. But I'm giving you the positive examples because they already create enough of a problem. I want to be able to interpret this sentence correctly, even though that second verb is missing there. So there are variants with clauses. There are some verb phrase examples too. We gave books to Kim and magazines to Chang, that example I showed you before. We also have with verb phrase complements, they persuaded some to buy stocks and others to buy bonds. The second persuade is missing, but now I have a verb phrase over here instead of those nice well-behaved noun phrases and prepositional phrases. Here I have more things missing. We gave books to Brown yesterday, magazines to Chang this morning, and letters to DeVito this afternoon. So in each of those three conjuncts, I have three things, and they have to kind of line up in the right way. I've got to maintain a certain amount of bookkeeping as I analyze the sentence, because I've got to put give back in notionally into two additional places and make sure that the parts all have the right shapes and the right position and the right relative ordering. As I said, it's annoying. There are interactions with other phenomena that we have also studied, which we do already have inside the fold. They're things that our grammars typically know how to do well. There is something called across-the-board extraction. That's like, which book did John write and Mary read? So Mary's doing the reading, John's doing the writing. There's a single book, and I pulled it out of both of those clauses. So in this example, which message did you send to Kim on Tuesday and to Chang on Friday? There's a sending going on, and there's a message involved in each of those sending events. But the message came up here to the front, and the second send just vanished altogether from the second phrase. So that last part of the sentence is missing a couple of things. One of those I can already account for, the movement of that message up here to the front. That's okay. That's a thing English does. Lots of languages do that dislocation for WH questions. I'm not frightened by that. I have a notion about across-the-board extraction already. That's part of a good test for an account of coordination and these unbounded dependencies. But then when you throw in gapping, it gets messy. I'm troubled by that. Right node raising is another phenomenon where we, instead of moving that thing that's missing up to the front, like which message, we can shift it in English off to the right. You can say Mary relies on and visits her grandmother every week, where rely on and visit are two verb phrase conjunctions, and then her grandmother gets pushed off to the right, as grandmothers often do. And so in this case, I have Marco delivered on Tuesday in Paris and on Friday in Rome, the same consistent message. So there's two delivering events going on. And the message is the same message, but it's appearing in both of those places. Both of those have vanished from on Friday in Rome. All I have left are the decorators about when and where it happened, but not what was happening and what it happened to. Again, we have solved part of that problem already, but this gapping throws a new wrinkle, creates another challenge for that. And then a couple more things. Multiple conjuncts, I already showed you this example where there are three things I've stacked up, but only one mention of giving. The other two are missing. And then we have these so-called correlative conjunctions. That's just to show you some additional terminology you can use at the bar later to show you've mastered some linguistics. That just means we have these pairings of either or, neither nor, both, and many languages have that kind of pairing. It makes processing a little easier, makes learning the language a little harder. In some languages, you always have to do it. In English, it's mostly optional. You don't always have to. And you can use those often as cues to say, where are the bounds of those two things I'm conjoining, or the multiple things I'm conjoining? And the fact that I can say one should neither give cigarettes to minors nor alcohol to teetotalers, that neither and nor says this nor marks the beginning of that second verb phrase. I can't really be too lazy about how I analyze these sentences, because there are these rather pointed markers, overt markers that tell me where the bounds of those phrases are. And I can't really cheat on those. I have an account of those correlative conjunctions about where they can appear. They're at the boundaries of these phrases. It kind of forces me into a phrasal account of these guys where I might have looked for some more less sophisticated analysis. All of the examples I just showed you before came out of my head. That's what we do as linguists. We make up the language. We give you examples of what goes on. But I want to show you a few examples from two widely used corpora in our field to show you that this kind of data, these examples, these problems, these opportunities really exist. They're there in the corpus. We have to figure out what to do with them. So the Brown corpus is among the oldest of the carefully annotated corpora. It's 1 million words of English text. It was put together back in the 1960s, believe it or not, 50 years ago, and annotated both for morphology, syntax, not very much semantics at the time, part of speech. And it was an early attempt at a balanced corpus, that is, at showing written language in its various uses, for fiction, nonfiction, for giving recipes, for reporting not cricket games, but baseball games, because it was an American corpus. There have since been much larger corpora put together, but not corpora that are as carefully annotated at that kind of scale. And so in this corpus of a mix of literature and nonfiction, you get examples like, you've sent your daughter to Miss X's Select Academy for Girls and your son to Miss Y's Select Academy for Boys. Sending in both cases, but the second send is missing. He shook his head, kept his face expressionless and his voice very calm, and had a strongly supported alibi ready. That's what I usually do. And so here you see this gap construction that keep his face expressionless and keep his voice calm. That's an embedded verb phrase inside of a larger conjunction of three bigger verb phrases. And down inside of that second one is where this magic happens with the disappearing act for the second keep, where it disappears. So there's even more fun happening. The Wall Street Journal is another even more carefully used tool, richly, widely used tool in our field. It's 1 million words from the Wall Street Journal from October of 1989, right after the earthquake in San Francisco, where I live. And in the year when the San Francisco Giants and their opposing team across the bay were busy playing one of the most important baseball games of the season. That game was stopped because of the earthquake, but then continued later. In that year, lots of companies traded and bought and sold stock in really boring ways. And 1 million words of that are now upon us as computational linguists, which we all study intently because it is a kind of common basis for comparison and contrast, for work in the field. Some of the sentences are a little more fun than others. You can find here examples like, let me show you this one, long stretches of this attendant ground activity, never mind all the rest of that, watching the silver mist rise off the river and the French cows amble about the fields. To me, that's not the greatest sentence, but it's very literary, very, very entertaining. But what's missing here is the second watching, right? There was 2 events of watching going on here. Mists in the first one and cows in the second. And we were watching them do something, either rising or ambling, walking around slowly. Here we have the company owes millions to a particular group and a specified amount to another group. So that's a more typical boring sentence within this corpus. There's 2 owing events, with the amount being owed and the thing being owed to, and the second verb missing. I think you're getting the idea about this. We also have, instead of that, those were all instances of a verb phrase, one common subject, and then 2 verb phrases where the second verb was missing. That's not strictly speaking gapping among linguist terms. That would be called conjunction reduction, but I'm pretending they're all gapping. They're all instances where a verb's missing. These are the more canonical cases where the subject and the rest of the verb phrase are both distinct. The only thing that's missing is the verb from the second sentence. So this could have been whenever the place was cleaned or a meal was served. That would be the helpful full sentence coordination. Here the was dropped out of the second one, and it's also using an or instead of an and. So you don't get a false impression that this weird construction only happens with the word and. It happens with all of these, and but, or and but, and any other conjunction you can come up with which you can defend as a conjunction. Here is a stranger one. Time is a queer thing and memory a queerer. So there is missing, but also the thing. That thing being missing, I'm not too troubled by that. I know how to do missing nouns in noun phrases, even though that's another instance of a head doing a disappearing act. That's one I can kind of cope with already. These verbs are more annoying because they have a bigger impact. They shape more of the sentence. A little flush came on her pale, homely face and enchantment in her eyes. It's an inverted construction where ordinarily subjects come before verbs in English, but in this case, there's a modifier phrase that decides. No, I guess it's not. It's not an inverted construction. It's that the flesh was here in the first instance. Enchantment is the subject of the second one, and what's missing is that verb came. Okay, not many more examples, but one other set, just to fill out for you. Back to the boring stream of the Wall Street Journal, but again, this instance of only the verb missing, but the subjects and verb phrases are both different in the clause. This is a lousy sentence, I'd say, probably not English. The workers can be motivated and the company reach its full potential. The word can is omitted from this one. I think that's just poor writing, but it's there in the corpus, and I can't really say why it's ungrammatical if it is. So let's pretend it's English. The other one I want to point to is this guy. Philip Glass is the emperor, and his music the new clothes of the avant-garde. This is a kind of double action here. The verb is missing. That is not a very big verb, but it's still an important verb, missing from that second clause. And then I took that of the avant-garde out from both of those phrases and shifted it off to the right, that right note raising. So it's like in the gymnastic competition. The first one looks pretty easy, and then they start adding more flips and spins and turns. This is a sort of double axel version of these constructions where I'm applying multiple methods of amusement in the language in order to make things happen. One final set just to show you that if you thought you had an analysis brewing in your head, I'd be happy to have that when we're done. If you thought you did, then you'd have to despair and run the other direction, because there are examples where more than just the verb is missing, whole swaths of the sentence somehow just vanish in the process of going from sentence 1 to 2. So the Perch-and-Dall fields are expected to start producing next year, and the Seahorse and Tarwin fields later next year. So the thing that's missing here is not just expected, but it's expected to start producing. There's a chunk that's missing from there. Likewise here, platinum is believed to have good support around $480 and palladium at around $130. So this whole thing is missing after palladium. These big chunks are gone. I don't pretend to know how to do these guys, and I don't think anyone else does. So I'm going to be happy if I can climb K2, if I can get to the second highest of the mountains and leave Everest for somebody later. There are, as linguists, we tend to pick our problems, do the ones we know how to do, and then give up on the rest of them, or postpone them to later. Or find graduate students, always useful. So one of the things that I have been finessing up to now is I've only been showing you positive examples. Say, well, why don't you just write a rule that says words can come in any order in the language? Great. That grammar would give me those as good sentences, but might not tell me much about their meaning. That's also not quite sufficient. So let me walk you through to prepare you for the ungrammatical example. You can in English say they donated money to the charity last week and donated paintings to the museum today. Well, by now you've learned that that's a cumbersome way to say that. Why don't we just drop that second donate? So you can instead say they donated money to the charity and donated and paintings to the museum today. One donate, perfectly nice sentence, easy to understand. You can also say they donated money last week and paintings today. I've changed the structure, right? I'm now not telling you who's being donated to, but rather the object being donated, still the time of the week or the day. And I can say they donated to the charity last week and to the museum today. So I can put both the recipient and the object and the time location in, or some subset of those. All this looks fine, right? But now if I try to do the obvious thing with my new not yet described account of gapping, I might expect that this sentence is good. They donated money last week and to the museum today. Because after all, I have they donated money last week and donated to the museum today. Perfectly fine first sentence. This isn't English. You just don't say it. You can't say that. And it's not because it's pragmatically odd. It's something about the syntax of this phenomena. That gapping requires an extremely high degree of parallelism. You can drop that verb, but only if you have helped the hearer by making everything else say more or less the same. You've kept the pieces constant. And suddenly swapping from the thing being donated to the recipient of the donation in the second clause, something about that means can't do it. That's too much work for the hearer or something. Or it's what we call syntax. It's the mysteries of the language. The semantics, remember, I'm trying to aim at a mapping between form and meaning representation, where the meaning for the moment, let's say, is something like this logical form. In Kim gave Pat books and Sal toys, I want a give predication that holds between Kim, Pat, and books, and between Kim, Sal, and toys. Two different giving events, presumably. Maybe on the same Christmas morning, but still two giving events that I would describe. The puzzles that we face in trying to build analyses of these machines can use are who gives me that second give? It's not there in the individual words that are in the sentence. I have to know which guy to grab and how to make a copy of it and where to make that copy and how to make sure that everything else is connected up properly. I could do that with two different kinds of magic. I could have a separate rule of the language that says, okay, build a verb phrase with all these pieces, and then build another verb phrase and just leave out the first verb, but the second verb, make a copy of it from the first one. But of course, that's a tricky rule to write because verb phrases can have lots of different shapes. Modifiers, adjuncts, complements, there's lots of things you can put in or take out. You can also remember to do those other magic tricks, like ripping something out from that verb phrase and bringing it to the front of the sentence or the back of the sentence. So whatever that rule would be, that construction, it will have to do something relatively fancy. Or you could do what many of us around these tables in the linguistics crowd do. We push things down into the lexicon. We say, there's enough rules already in the grammar. It's already messy. Let's try and introduce some richer lexical entries that do more of the work. So I could say, well, even though that word and, and I gave Mary a book and Sally a record, that sounds like the same and, I could say, no, that's ambiguous. That and is a very funny one, which essentially does the work of that second verb. That is, it acts not only as the conjunction, but also as the main verb predicating the rest of the sentence, and it knows to go copy itself from the first verb and then project the rest of the structure of that verb phrase sentence. That is the weird approach, but I think probably the right one. Or maybe there's some combination of the two where we have to have a relatively funny behavior for this word and, likewise for or and but, of course, and a special construction that tells us how to sew things together, because I want to get the meaning of this phrase right, not just the ordering of the words and the phrases. We have to make sure we can generalize this rule to allow for iteration. So it's not just two of these things. You saw that we can have three. I can have lots of them. Any number up to patience and human lifespan, I can tack on these conjuncts, these verb phrases missing the verb. I spent 2 years a while ago building an analysis that did an okay job as long as there were only two. And there's no way at all to generalize that analysis to handle three or more conjunctions. And so eventually my true linguist training re-emerged and I got too embarrassed and ripped out the analysis I had put into the grammar. It was just hard to explain even to myself, let alone to anyone I respected. So I'm now back to the drawing board this year, trying to figure out how to build, especially to focus on this task, this challenge of iteration, of being able to generalize that account. It's not funny about English. Most languages will do that if they have gapping. I want to preserve these syntactic dependencies, and then this is not my ambition for this year, what to do about those horrible cases where whole chunks of the sentence just vanished, disappeared, and would have to be reconstructed again. We will label that magic, and that will come in somewhere later in the process.